The elderly woman's voice cracked as she gave her answer. Steve Harvey stopped mid-laugh. The microphone slipped lower in his hand. And then, something no one in that studio had ever seen before, Steve Harvey forgot to be funny. He dropped the microphone to his side and walked toward them. Not for the show. Not for the cameras. For something bigger. The Family Feud studio that afternoon was like any other taping day. Bright lights, buzzing energy, two families ready to compete for cash and bragging rights. Steve Harvey was in his element, firing off jokes, working the crowd, keeping the pace electric. The producers had scheduled 6 episodes back to back. This was episode 4. Just another game. Just another family. But the Henderson family was different. Not in an obvious way. They didn't have matching shirts or rehearsed dance moves. They were quiet. Gentle. And at the center of their lineup stood George and Margaret Henderson, both 91 years old, married for 70 years. Margaret wore a soft pink cardigan. George, a light gray suit jacket that had seen better days but was pressed with care. They held hands at the podium, fingers intertwined like they'd been that way for 7 decades. Their grandson had written to the show months earlier. "My grandparents have never missed an episode. It would mean the world to them." The producers thought it was sweet. A feel-good story. Good optics. They didn't know what was coming. But what happened next would stop the entire studio cold and rewrite what everyone thought they knew about love, loss, and what it means to hold on. The game started normally. Steve introduced the families with his signature energy. The Hendersons versus the Cartwrights. Standard questions. Standard answers. Laughter. Applause. Everything on script. Then came round 3. We asked 100 married people. Steve read from the card, his voice smooth and practiced. "What is the one thing that kept your marriage strong through the hardest times?" It was supposed to be a light-hearted question. Answers like communication, or date nights, or separate bathrooms, that Steve could riff on. Easy comedy. The kind of setup he'd done 1,000 times. Margaret stepped up to the buzzer. George stayed close beside her, his hand still holding hers. Steve looked at them with a grin. "All right, Margaret, you've been married 70 years. 70. You're basically a marriage scientist at this point." The audience laughed. Margaret smiled, but there was something in her eyes. Something deeper than the moment called for. "Steve," she said softly, "can I tell you something before I answer?" The room shifted. You could feel it. Steve's smile faltered just slightly. He leaned in, instinct taking over. "Of course, baby. What's on your heart?" Margaret glanced at George. He nodded. She took a breath. "We lost our daughter 53 years ago. She was 6 years old. Car accident." The studio went silent. Steve's hand, still holding the microphone, slowly lowered. His face, always so animated, went still. Margaret continued, her voice steady but weighted with decades of grief. "For 2 years after that, George and I barely spoke. We were in the same house, but we were strangers. I blamed him for letting her ride with his brother that day. He blamed himself. We were drowning." George squeezed her hand. His jaw tightened. "I packed my bags twice," Margaret said. "Twice, I was ready to leave. But both times, George did something that stopped me." Steve didn't move. The audience didn't breathe. He didn't beg. He didn't make promises. He just sat next to me on the edge of the bed and said, "If you go, I understand. But if you stay, we survive this together. Not tomorrow. Just today. One day at a time." Subscribe and leave a comment, because what Margaret said next became the answer that would trend worldwide and redefine what millions believed about marriage. Margaret looked directly at Steve, tears balanced on the edge of her lashes but not falling. "So my answer, Steve, is this: we didn't stay married because it was easy. We stayed married because we decided grief didn't get to win. Not over us. Not over what we built." She pressed the buzzer. "Forgiveness," she said. "The answer is forgiveness." The board flipped. Number 1 answer. 42 points. But no one cheered. Because Steve Harvey, the man who had hosted thousands of episodes, who never missed a beat, who always had a joke ready, stood frozen in the middle of the stage. His eyes were red. His lips pressed together. He turned away from the camera for a moment, his hand covering his mouth. The producers in the booth leaned forward. This wasn't in the script. This wasn't the show. When Steve turned back, he wasn't the host anymore. He was just a man, standing in front of two people who had lived a love story that defied every odd. He walked over to them. Slowly. Deliberately. The microphone hung loose in his hand. "George," Steve said, his voice thick. "You mind if I ask you something?" George looked up at him. "Go ahead, son. How did you do it? How did you not break?" George's weathered face softened. "I did break, Steve. Every day for 2 years I broke. But Margaret, she was breaking too. And one morning I realized, if we're both breaking, we might as well break together. And maybe if we break in the same place, we can put each other back." Steve closed his eyes. When he opened them, there were tears. He reached up, took off his suit jacket, the expensive tailored navy blazer he wore for every taping, and draped it over George's shoulders. "You wear this today," Steve said, "because you've earned more respect than I'll ever have." The audience erupted. But it wasn't applause. It was something rawer. People were standing, crying, holding each other. The opposing family, the Cartwrights, broke protocol. They walked across the stage and embraced the Hendersons. All of them. Competitors became family. Steve stood in the middle of it all, in his shirt sleeves, tears streaming down his face, and for once in his career, he had no words. A producer's voice crackled in his earpiece. "Steve, we need to keep moving." Steve pulled the earpiece out and set it on the podium. "We're not moving," he said to the camera. "Not yet." He turned back to Margaret and George. "You said you almost left twice," Steve said to Margaret. "What stopped you the second time?" Margaret smiled, the kind of smile that holds a lifetime. "The second time, I didn't pack the bags. I just asked George one question: if we stay, what do we fight for? And he said, we fight to remember her by loving each other the way she would have wanted." She paused. "That little girl loved us so much, Steve. And if we fell apart, it would be like losing her twice. So we chose to stay. Not because the pain went away. It never did. But because love is stronger than loss. It has to be." Behind the scenes, something happened that no producer expected. Steve made a decision that would become one of the most talked about moments in television history. Steve looked at the cameras, then at the audience. "I'm supposed to finish this game right now," he said. "I'm supposed to move to fast money and keep this train rolling. But I'm not going to do that." The studio fell silent again. "Because what these two people just taught us is worth more than a game. It's worth more than a show. It's worth stopping for." He turned to the producers in the booth. "Cut the cameras if you want. But I'm staying right here." No one cut the cameras. Steve sat down on the stage floor, cross-legged, looking up at George and Margaret like a student before a teacher. "Tell me more," he said. "Tell me how you made it through the years after. Tell me what you learned." And they did. For 20 minutes, unscripted, unplanned, George and Margaret Henderson shared their story. They talked about the fights. The silent dinners. The nights they slept facing opposite walls. The morning George left a note on the bathroom mirror that said, "I still choose you." They talked about how they planted a garden in their daughter's memory. How every year on her birthday, they'd sit in that garden and tell stories about her. Not sad stories. Funny ones. Joyful ones. "We learned," George said, "that grief is just love with no place to go. So we gave it a place. We gave it to each other." Steve wiped his face with the back of his hand. "How did you forgive yourself, George? That's the part one don't understand." George's voice cracked for the first time. "I didn't. Not for years. But Margaret, she told me something I'll never forget. She said you can't bring her back. But you can honor her by being the man she believed you were. He looked at his wife. That's when I started healing. Not because I deserved it, but because she gave me permission. Margaret squeezed his hand. We gave each other permission to be broken. And that's what saved us. Steve stood up slowly. He walked to the edge of the stage, looked out at the audience, many of whom were holding tissues, some holding each other. Everybody in here, Steve said. Everybody watching at home, I want you to understand something. This right here? This is what it looks like when love wins. Not the fairy tale kind. The real kind. The kind that gets knocked down and gets back up. The kind that says I'm staying even when every part of you wants to run. He turned back to the Hendersons. You two have given every person in this room a gift today. You've shown us that love isn't about never falling apart. It's about falling apart together and choosing to rebuild. The audience stood again. This time, the applause was thunderous. But Steve held up his hand. One more thing, he said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card. He handed it to George. This is my personal number. I don't give this to many people. But I want you to call me. Because I need to hear more of your story. And I think the world does too. George took the card with shaking hands. We'd be honored, Steve. Margaret leaned forward and kissed Steve on the cheek. Thank you for letting us talk about her, she whispered. No one ever lets us talk about her. Steve's face crumpled. He pulled them both into an embrace. Share and subscribe, because what happened after the cameras stopped rolling proves that some moments are too powerful to stay on a stage. After the taping, Steve didn't go to his dressing room. He sat with George and Margaret in the green room for 2 hours. They talked. They cried. They laughed. Steve called his wife, Marjorie, on FaceTime. Baby, I need you to meet these people, he said. And she did. She drove to the studio and sat with them. The Hendersons' grandson later shared that Steve sent flowers to their home every month for a year. On the card, always the same message. For the garden. For her memory. With love, Steve. The episode aired 3 weeks later. Within 24 hours, it had 80 million views online. It trended in 47 countries. News outlets called it the moment television remembered its heart. Therapists shared the clip in sessions. Marriage counselors played it in workshops. Churches screened it during services. Because George and Margaret Henderson didn't just answer a game show question that day. They answered a question the world had been asking for generations. How do you love someone after the worst thing happens? And the answer was simple, devastating, and beautiful. You choose to. Every single day. Even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. Steve Harvey never forgot that day. In interviews years later, he would say, I've met presidents. I've met billionaires. I've met celebrities. But George and Margaret Henderson taught me more about life in 20 minutes than anyone ever has. He kept that suit jacket. The one he gave to George. George tried to return it after the show, but Steve refused. You keep it, Steve said. And when people ask you about it, you tell them the story. You tell them love wins. George wore that jacket to Margaret's funeral 4 years later. He wore it to his grandson's wedding. He wore it the day he planted a new tree in their daughter's garden. And when George passed away at 95, he was buried in it. At his funeral, the pastor read a letter George had written years earlier. In it, he thanked Steve Harvey for giving him and Margaret a moment to honor their daughter's memory. But more than that, he thanked him for stopping the show. Most people, George wrote, keep moving because stopping is too hard. But Steve stopped. And in that stopping, he gave us space to breathe. To remember. To love out loud. The final line of the letter. Love isn't about never breaking. It's about breaking beautifully. Together. That letter now hangs in Steve Harvey's home office. He reads it before every taping of Family Feud. Because that day, in that studio, an elderly couple didn't just share the secret to 70 years of marriage. They shared the secret to being human: stay, fight, forgive, remember. And when the world tells you to keep moving, sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stop. Steve Harvey learned that lesson, and he's never forgotten it. George and Margaret showed the world that love isn't a feeling. It's a decision you make every morning when your feet hit the floor. And sometimes the greatest love stories aren't about never falling apart. They're about choosing to stay when everything tells you to leave. That's the secret to 70 years. That's the secret to everything.